Hey friends, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from this lesson right here, Ephesians. This week we're studying from lesson number 10, which has the title, Husbands and Wives Together at the Cross. And today is Tuesday's lesson, which has the title, The Church as the Bride of Christ, Part 2. You'll remember that yesterday we presented 5 different ways in which the text demonstrates Jesus caring, loving, and preparing his bride for the wedding ceremony himself. The lesson today begins with a 6th element here. It completes the idea, and it has to do with Jesus presenting the bride to himself. Now, that never happened. In today's weddings, it never happens. Today, usually, the bride walks down the aisle, and either her father or a brother or someone very special presents her to the bridegroom. But in this story right here, Jesus kind of breaks the custom. The apostle here, he presents an analogy that breaks off at this point, where Jesus is presenting the church himself. And so here you do have a few differences, but it couldn't be any different. Who else could present the church as the bride of Christ other than Christ himself, other than God himself? And so it's different than what used to happen and what happens today, but it's also very appropriate with what we're talking about, the seriousness of what we're talking about, as the way that God in Christ loves the bride, loves the church. Because after all, we're talking about husbands and wives being together at the cross. And if we talked before about how wives should treat their husbands, we also have to talk about how husbands treat their wives. It's supposed to be a two-way street, not a unilateral relationship, not just one-sided. It has to come from both ends. And so as wives should treat their husbands, there's also the way in which the husband should treat his wife. And the text tells us that the husband should love their wives just as Jesus loved the church. And here we're reading just exactly how Jesus loved the church. So that's what we're going to be continuing today. And today, the lesson also provides a chronological pattern as to how this happened. The first one is betrothal. It's the first thing that happens here in how Christ offers himself to his church. Today's lesson really is a reflection of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 through 4. I'm going to read it for you actually before we start. And it says, "Oh, that you would bear with me a little folly, and indeed you do bear with me. For I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he who comes preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you may well put up with it." So here you have the context behind what the apostle is. So here you have the context behind what the apostle is talking about here in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 through 27, and then verse 29. And so going back to that text, as we were talking before, there's a chronological pattern that the apostle presents as to this wedding, this marriage with Christ. The first is the betrothal. Christ offered himself up for the church as the bride price, and so became betrothed to her. That's the first order here of the story. The second is the preparation for the wedding ceremony. The attentions of the bridegroom continue in his present efforts to sanctify and cleanse the bride. The third is the wedding ceremony itself, where Christ's present attentions are in view of the presentations of the bride at the wedding. This appears in verse 27. This last element looks to the grand wedding celebration at his return, when Christ, the bridegroom, will come to claim the church as his bride and present her to himself. Friends, here we find ultimately the plan of the bridegroom is to present the church to himself, and this we know to be the second coming. This parallels the ancient wedding ceremonies where the bridegroom would leave his house with a whole group of people, his whole entourage, and they would proceed in a procession over to the bride's house. Or maybe they would meet the bride as she came with her own entourage through the streets. And so they would meet, and then they would go to their new wedding place. And then they would go to their new home where they were going to live together, and they would begin a week of festivities. Can you imagine something like that? A week of partying that way? And then finally, it would culminate with the wedding ceremony. And so here, this is what we see as the ancient wedding ceremonies, but we know that what it represents is the church being taken up to heaven with Jesus at the second coming. That is what the text is reflecting here in today's lesson. That's what we're supposed to learn here. This part 1 and part 2, reflecting how Christ prepares the bride as the church. And this is how ultimately we see the comparison, the contrast as to how husbands should love their wives. How did Jesus love the bride? This is how husbands should love their wives. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with this whole conversation. We're going to look at this other side of the story where husbands love their wives. The title of tomorrow's lesson tells us that, love your wife as you do yourself. And so here we see how Jesus loved the church. I don't want you to miss the point because this is crucial into the understanding of this whole conversation. We've looked at the wife, how she should love her husband, how she should behave regarding her husband, and now we're going to see how the husband should behave regarding his wife, with this as the backdrop of that conversation. I hope today's study was a blessing to you. Please remember to like, to share, and to subscribe to these videos. We release one every day. Also, please remember to comment down below if you have a question or if you would like to interact with me. That's awesome. And I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another Sabbath School Daily.